Welcome to the End the Silence podcast. I'm your host, Sandra Payne. As an RN and holistic wellness coach working with nurses, I am uniquely positioned to hear the struggles, the deep passions, and the stories of nurses, our silent heroes. Many nurses suffer with burnout, depression, anxiety, PTSD, substance abuse, and suicidality, and they do so in silence. Nurses are the ones we turn to for help when we need it the most, and this is a heavy burden to carry. This burden to be strong and giving, coupled with the fear of speaking up and the unsupportive culture in our healthcare system, means many nurses have lost their voice. These are their stories. Today's guest is Natasha Burger. She is a registered nurse from Alberta, Canada, who has spent the first 20 years of her career working rural bedside nursing in a wide range of areas, including medical, surgery, peds, recovery, ICU, obstetrics, and the emergency room. She then moved to the city, working acute medicine, renal inpatient, ICU, correctional nursing, and then returned to the rural setting while her body was sending many signals to slow down. And it wasn't until later that she realized she really needed to step away from bedside to give herself the break her body was demanding. She then landed herself in a role with Connect Care, the new computerized charting system in Alberta, and is now the implementation lead. I've had the privilege of getting to know Natasha personally over the last few months, and I'm grateful to call this woman a dear friend who inspires me with her courage, her strength, her humor, and her undying love of chocolate. Welcome to the podcast, Natasha.
Hello, glad to be here.
Me too. I'm so happy that you're here joining me today. To start out, I would love to hear a little bit about your story. Like, who is Natasha inside and outside of nursing? Share with us a little bit about your story.
In a nutshell, I grew up in rural northern Alberta. My parents were back to the land hippies, so a lot of my childhood experiences are more reminiscent of a homesteader or settler. I get people sometimes asking me, how old are you? When I tell them I grew up in a log house with wood heat and a hand pump well. But no, everybody around us had all the amenities, just my parents chose to live differently. They'd both been city kids and they totally embraced the rural lifestyle. We had goats and chickens and a big garden. And so I grew up with that. When I graduated high school, I went away to university and found it very overwhelming and came back, not having completed anything. Went and worked in the hospital for a little while as a nurse's aide in the long-term care setting and as a physio aide, and found them both very interesting and was really drawn to the nursing part of it. And so that's what I went back to school for. I took my training in Edmonton at Grant MacEwan in the diploma program because it was one of the highly recommended ones for bedside nursing, and also short because I was not a city kid and I did not want to be in the city for any longer than I needed to be. But it turned out to be a really good thing because it did provide a very, very strong clinical background. I moved back to the country, married my high school sweetheart. We had kids. We grew apart and we're not together anymore, but I've got 2 adult children and I am still a country girl at heart. So I garden and I horseback ride and I do outside activities as much as I possibly can. I've always been interested in artistic things. We always had art supplies available as kids, so it never occurred to me that everybody didn't do that. And I've discovered now as an adult that my willingness to play around with art, even when it's completely insubordinate, is not a common thing. So I use that as a stress relief.
I love knowing that little bit about you, like when you were growing up with a hand pump well. That, I can see people asking you that question, like, how old are you?
Yes, I'm not a vampire. I've aged appropriately. No, I didn't really grow up in the 1800s. It's all okay.
So funny. So tell us a little bit about your life as a nurse then. So you graduated back in 1992. Tell us a little bit about your experience and kind of how you went through being a nurse.
Well, I went back to the small hospital that I had started out doing the long-term care aide in because they knew me and would hire me. At that point, there was a provincial hiring freeze, and getting a job someplace that you didn't already have a foot in the door was pretty close to impossible. So I worked casual positions and temporary part-times, got laid off a couple times through the Klein years, although there was always work. Worked part-time when my children were little and then went to full-time when they were both school age, and worked full-time in the small rural facility in all the different areas. And generally about every February or March, I would get cabin fever and want to orientate to a different unit. And that's why I ended up with all of the variety that I did. The facility used to be a 75-bed full-service facility, so I had that opportunity to do the medicine unit, the surgery unit, the pediatric unit, the obstetrical unit. PARR is post-anesthetic recovery room, so was able to do that. Learning some of the skills there encouraged me to go to the emergency department. Went to the emergency department full-time when the obstetrical services no longer happened in the High Prairie facility anymore due to some changes. And worked in the emergency department as my sort of favorite place to be. I liked the triage. I liked the acuity. I liked the patient teaching that I could do. I liked that my nursing skills could make a big difference in somebody's life. And the variety was a big appeal for me. Moved to Edmonton for family reasons and discovered, quite relieved actually, to discover that my skill set from rural nursing translated quite well to the higher acuity specialty units. I was worried that it wouldn't. It does. A nurse is not a nurse is not a nurse, no matter what they might tell you, but the skills do transfer. And it was interesting to learn the different specialties. Met somebody. When my children were graduated from high school, I moved down to central Alberta and tried out ICU there. Decided that was more of an adrenaline spot than I wanted to be. If I'd have found them in my 20s, those are my people. OCD, type A, highly organized, everything's labeled and color-coded. It was so pretty. But the level of adrenaline wasn't something that I wanted to put my body through every shift. And I missed some of the things about rural. I missed the labor and delivery. I missed the triage and emergency and the variety. It's not that there isn't variety in intensive care, because there certainly is, but there isn't the scope. So I went back to working rural. And while working rural, I started to think, I might maybe be becoming a little bit burnt out here. What am I going to do about this? And spent some time reviewing that. And that's led to some of my other explorations in correctional nursing and stepping away from the bedside to say, yeah, changing it up has not actually been enough. And I need to just step back from this for a little bit. I don't want to be that nurse that nobody wants to work with or nobody wants to look after them because they are so grumpy and burnt out. And so I've moved to Connect Care because it is a non-bedside thing where I can still work to support the nurses who still are at the bedside and transition to the more modern way that the charting is going, whether people would like it that way or not. I remember working rural north when the Meditech computer systems rolled out and the stresses that put on the clinicians. And we lost clinical bedside skills because people were frightened away because of the transition to Meditech. And I thought, we can do it better in Connect Care. We need that skill set. We need those people. We need to not frighten them off by something that is not a clinical thing. They are good at their jobs, and this shouldn't make them feel differently. And we need, as a society, we need that skill set at the bedside. So that's why I ended up in Connect Care. I'm a great bridge generation. As I said, I grew up with wood heat and a hand pump, but I also have a smartphone and I now have a tech job. So I understand the growth and the learning curve that creates. Thought I was a really good person to be a bridge between the nurses with the clinical skill set and maybe not the tech savvy and the computer people who are not understanding why the nurses are even worried about it.
Yeah, that word is perfect, like a bridge between those two, because I mean, how many times in so many different aspects of nursing is like we feel like there's some kind of cutoff between like what the nurses are experiencing and what they're saying about their issues or their challenges, and then what the people that are making decisions see as what they should be experiencing, right? Whether it's using a new tool or whether it's changing something else. You said something about being that nurse when you were talking a little bit about the burnout that you were experiencing. I was hoping maybe you could share with us a little bit more about how that was showing up for you. Like what does, I have my own vision of that nurse, of what she looks like. And I'm curious what she looked like for you when you were going through that.
For me, what it looked like on the outside at work, going back and talking to my colleagues, they said, well, we didn't really notice. You maybe looked a little more tired, but other than that, you were fine. And I thought, okay, good, it worked then. But it was taking me more and more energy to maintain that. It was taking more and more energy to be physically present at work. It was taking more and more energy for me to care about what I was doing at work. I was beginning to think of things as no big deal that used to be a big deal for me. I didn't have injuries. I wasn't off sick. I wasn't being reported for bad behavior or having a noticeable increase in mistakes or severity or altercations with patients or anything like that. But it was taking all of my energy to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I would get home from work not having stopped at the grocery store, even though I needed groceries because I couldn't people for one more second, and petting my dogs and getting myself a big glass of iced tea and heading to the hammock with my book and not having any energy whatsoever to weed the flower bed or make supper or do any of the things that would normally give me a work-life balance. And all I was doing was working and recovering from work.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't anything else.
Yeah. Just purely survival mode at that point.
Absolutely.
I think of, the nurses that are out there working, on the floors and at the bedside. The vast majority of them are kind of living in that right now, like this survival mode where I think that whole description of it just was taking all my energy to keep this front, to keep myself afloat while I was in this job that is so critical because, we have people's lives in our hands, and then just everything draining. And that resonates so deeply with me because I can remember it. And no one at my work would have known what I was going through either because I didn't show it. I was able to put on those masks and to put everything that I had. But then at home, I was a mess, right? Like just a mess and so tired, so emotional, and, just really out of control. Tell me, in all these years of experience and all these different patient populations you've worked with, what's been one of the biggest struggles that you've faced as a nurse?
Well, there's been lots of different struggles throughout the years, but I didn't see them as struggles. I just saw them as part of the job, and I enjoyed what I was doing. And I might have days where I was tired, but I didn't have days where I was like, what am I doing? Why did I pick this? And it was that realization as I was struggling with burnout that despite doing all the burnout prevention stuff that I'd learned and that I taught the people that I would have as, students and preceptors when I would be working on units that would have that, make sure you take your breaks, learn to say no, delegate appropriately, do the self-care. The biggest struggle was discovering that even though I'd done all those things, I still ended up with a severe enough burnout that I'm laying in my hammock crying and not doing anything for myself other than getting up and going to work and paying the bills. And the realization that I was burnt out and that it was before I was 50. And so that would be the greatest struggle. I'm not sure if that's what you meant, though.
No, sure. Your greatest struggle is not for me to decide. It's what you felt as a nurse. And I think that's a really valid point, is that we don't always see it coming. And we're also whole human beings. We have lives outside of being a nurse, right? You were a mom, you were married, you had parents, you have a life. And when we combine all of the different stressors together, sometimes, just taking our breaks is not enough. Sometimes just making sure that we drink water during the day it's not enough. Like, we need a little bit more. Yeah. So, I'm not here to judge what your biggest struggle is. I think recognizing what's going on inside of us for a lot of people is one of the biggest struggles, because we don't want to be that. We don't want to be that nurse that is burnt out, but we also don't want to be the nurse that gets burnt out. Mm-hmm. Such a stigma to being strong and being able to hack it and just be able to push through all of the shit that nursing throws at us. But then also, when it is affecting you, we can't necessarily speak up about it, because then again, there's a certain stigma around weakness. And
well, I spent probably 2 years doing my professional association self-evaluation and what are your learning goals for the year. And the first year that I decided I needed to look at it, I was like, what is burnout and am I? And went to every course I could go to and read all the books that I could find, nursing and non-nursing. And at the end of the year went, yeah, burnout is what I thought. And yeah, I am. And so then I made my second year a focus of, okay, so now what? And found that there was a lot of information on what is burnout and how to assess if you might be. But there really wasn't a whole lot on what to do about it that didn't involve either the real basics of take your breaks and drink your water, or quit your job and rediscover what you're doing. And there really wasn't anything in between. And so I really struggled with that as well, that come on, there has to be something that's not an all or none. For me, the idea of stepping away from bedside without having a physical reason that I had to do it meant that I was somewhat of a failure, that I hadn't been able to cope with the regular stresses of the day-to-day nursing, because there hadn't been anything super traumatic that I could say this incident was a pivotal change in my career. It was just an accumulation of all of the different stressors that are normal with nursing, trying to reconcile that with myself. And it was my recognition that if I don't do something about it, I will, again, pay the physical price. I've done migraines, I've done ulcers, I've done heart disease, I've had ablation and adenosine, and I don't want to do that again. It really is not a whole lot of fun. And given that my cardiologist says that it was, yes, definitely 100% a stress response, that I ended up with the SVT in the first place, I need to manage my stress and cortisol levels, or my body will come up with something physical. And so I had to recognize that if I don't deal with the mental health component of it, when it is only a mental health component, at some point not too far down the road, my body will say, all right, then here, this is what we're doing because you're not listening. And I did not want to get to that point again. And I'm a bit of a slow learner, given that I got there a couple times.
It's such an incredible thing to bring up because, you know, mental health, emotional health, let's tie them together, but they carry a stigma. And if I cut myself, I don't need to explain to you why it hurts. I don't need to explain to you that I need to heal. But if my mental health or my emotional health is struggling or suffering in some way, I can't relay that to you in a really effective way, or there's such a stigma that I don't know how to. And this whole concept around being a failure, fear of being a failure and fear of, or this belief that we're not good enough, those are two of our biggest demons that so many of us carry. And this profession, I think, is, you know, particularly reveals that to people, is like, I don't want to feel like I've failed, right? I got into this profession for whatever reasons, and you dedicate all this money and all this time, and you really want to make a difference. And then to see yourself struggling in a way that's taking you away from your ability to be able to be that person, do those things, that just has such a significant impact on us. So thank you for sharing that. I think many people who listen and watch will resonate with what you've just said. Now, of course, you know, let's flip the coin, because it's not all bad, right? You've had years of experience, and there's a lot of good that we take from this job, from this profession. And I'm wondering, like, what's been kind of like your biggest success or your biggest fulfillment that you've received from being a nurse?
I think my biggest fulfillment is those moments in time where what I did as a nurse made a difference to that patient, whether it was holding somebody's hand when that's what they needed, or being the technical person who's titrating their drips in ICU, and everything in between. That being able to have that direct impact right there with that person in all the different things that a nurse can do, because the holding the hand might be just as valuable as knowing how to titrate the drip for the right person. And the privilege, because it really, really is a privilege to be present in people's best and worst moments, and the transitions of birth and the transitions of death, and to be somebody who is trusted to be there and to be able to help if needed, and to be able to go get help if what I can do is not enough. And it's shown up in many, many different ways, and in people thanking me for things that I considered just normal. The street guy being discharged home from his room at the Alec, and I'd gone in to help him because he was tangled in his bedding and his IVs and trying to get to the bathroom and making a mess everywhere. And he was old and grumpy. Old and grumpy people are usually my favorites. I get along really well with them. They say life sucks. Golden years aren't golden. I'm like, you're right, they're not. What can we do to make that better today? And he came and found me and thanked me. And all I thought I'd done was a very basic anybody would do. Help him get untangled, help him get tidied up with some dignity, and get to the bathroom. But apparently for him, that was a worthwhile thing to note, that when he went home 2 days later and I was not his nurse, he came and found me. I think we don't know the impact we have when we have it, because I'd have never thought that that was an impactful moment on his life. Would never have occurred to me, except he came and told me.
Yeah, such a good story. I'm as you're talking, I'm thinking and remembering it's triggering these experiences I've had, and what was standing out is the times where a patient took the extra bit of effort to come and thank me, just like he did for you, like just to, and little things that we do, those little things that are just a part of our job. But when someone's in their most vulnerable state and we take the time to attend to their needs, I don't know if we can really grasp the full scope of how much impact that does have on people, and how much a thank you goes, how much power a thank you holds, right? Or a little bit of recognition towards someone who is going above and beyond, or even if they're just struggling and they're doing the very minimum, when someone recognizes you and sees you for what you're doing, like what that makes you feel like inside. Here's a question I love. If you could go back to your first day of nursing school, what would be a piece of advice you would give to your younger self?
I would still become a nurse. I know that I've heard different people say, oh, if I could just go back, I would tell them to do something different, that the world is different now. You don't have to be a nurse or a teacher or a mom. You can do whatever it is that you want. There's other things available. But I chose nursing on purpose. I knew that there was other things I could do. It wasn't a default choice for me, and I would still do it. It's been good for me in many, many, many things. But what I would do to my working self is I would say work part-time. Don't ever work more than part-time. Make sure that you keep that work-life balance. Just because your kids are bigger and they've gone to school doesn't mean that you have all the time and energy to now go and work full-time, because it takes more energy than it takes time. And base your entire life on that working part-time for both the financial reasons and the time reasons, because then you have an ongoing work-life balance that maybe is easier to maintain and not lose and have to try and find again. And the other thing that I've discovered is you get used to spending however much money you make. And if you create debt based on working full-time and then are the only income earner in your household as a single mom, you then are required to keep up that income, even if you would rather do something different for work-life balance. Or you can no longer pay your mortgage or any of the other things that you've set up for. And I would do it differently so that I was not in that position, regardless of what my other income was when I started. Because when I started, I was not a single mom and was counting on a household income. And that income part has unfortunately been a factor in some of my decisions that have impacted my work-life balance. That if I had made the decision early on that I was going to only work part-time, I think I could have maybe had some different outcomes.
That's such an interesting perspective. It's, I think sometimes we put that money piece as a part of the goal, a part of the need, and it's often at an imbalance to what our true needs are. And, I think that's just such an interesting perspective. I know working part-time makes a significant difference in the amount of time you have, right? Yes. And so if you can use that time to better yourself, to heal, to deal with stress, to, find that balance, I can see that being a really powerful shift had your younger self had this tidbit of wisdom.
Well, there's sort of the thought that if you can be working full time, you should be. And I agreed with that at the time and did, and worked full-time shift work with kids at home, and then was a single mom working full-time shift work with kids at home. If I could go back and do it over, I would not do that. I would work part-time and figure out how to balance my books, because that would be an easier thing to do than to juggle the work-life balance that I juggled. That looking back and talking to my kids, there's things that I would definitely have done different. I thought I had done a fairly good job with that for them. There's things that I wish I'd done differently. Of course, we all do in hindsight, but that would be my advice to somebody starting out. Don't ever work more than full-time. Don't make that commitment. Maybe pick up hours if that's something you feel like you would like to do, but don't ever make that as a commitment, and don't ever make it part of your financial planning.
Amazing advice. I'm curious if you could come up with one thing, because I know this is hard. One thing that if you could see change in the nursing profession, you think would create an impact for, the existing nurses, the ones that are coming up into the profession. One thing, what do you think?
I think if we could make teaching in nursing school burnout and self-care as not optional, you need to do this. And even if you need to present it you need to put on your own oxygen mask first before you can help others kind of a perspective. I had a nursing instructor who would penalize us if we didn't take our breaks on time. Because she said, unless there's a code or a baby delivering, there is no reason why you should not be able to get to your break on time. It's bad time management if you can't put some time in for you. But she was the only instructor who did that. And I don't know that that's a commonplace thing. And it should be that this is part of what you have to budget your time for. And if the workplaces would treat it as an identified hazard and not a personal failing, when somebody does have issues with burnout, stress leave, or whatever it is you want to call it. Because unless you have a very supportive manager or a very supportive physician or both, you can end up in a position of it being almost worse, going and saying, I need to take some time. I'm not at my best here. This job needs me at my best, and I can't do this right now. And my family needs me at my best, and I need me at my best. I need to take some time. It's not often, I don't think, well received. And I think that needs to change. I think it needs to be, oh, thank goodness you recognize that. Good. How much time do you need? What can we do to support you? Rather than, oh, well, that's inconvenient, which I think is often the response that happens, whether it's said out loud or not.
Yeah.
And that I think would be the biggest thing that I would like to see changed.
Reminded of like how we have to take, certain trainings are required, right? For us to be in different areas as a nurse, like CPR training, right? As an example. Yes, I totally agree with you that we should be training and teaching nurses coming up and for that matter, doctors, respiratory therapists, all the people that are coming into this healthcare arena about burnout, about mental health, emotional health, about self-care, about self-preservation, self-regulation, all of those things. I think those are critical skills for human beings, not just for nurses. But then a continued education, right? Not just when we get to a point where we feel like we are struggling, because we know that prevention is always a better strategy than picking up the pieces of it afterwards, right? And so much of healthcare is not like that, is not focused on prevention. So, I'm reminded of this sort of analogy I have of like, we need to change the idol that nurses strive to be like. And this idol right now is one that, puts her head down and just suffers in silence. We need to change that to one who prioritizes herself, who says that I am equally as important as this job, as my family. Like I am on the playing field and I deserve to be considered. And when we can change this shift, and part of it is exactly like you said, the response and the stigma that is around people that need help or nurses that need help, is saying like, yes, congratulations. I'm so happy that you're recognizing these early signs. Let's implement some strategies. Here's a course that you can take. Here's a workshop you can attend. This is a really amazing counselor or coach or whatever that you can work with, so that we give them the strategies instead of just like, making them feel like they're a failure and they're letting their whole unit down and, really inconveniencing everybody. So I love that you mentioned that. I think it's so important. I'm curious, Natasha, what's been some of like your most helpful tools that you have learned or developed to help you deal with stress and the emotional overwhelm that happens as a nurse?
Most of it has been taking my own advice, because I don't think that there's really any of us in nursing or any of the other healthcare professions who don't have a pretty good idea of what it takes. We teach our patients about it all the time. But when it applies to us, it's very difficult to actually listen to your own good advice and do it. And that would be probably my top tool is my own advice. I know. If I stop and think about it, well, what do I need? Well, I need time. Okay, well, what do I need to do with that time? Well, I need to not be thinking about work. So what am I going to be doing with that time instead? Well, you need to book something fun for you and go do something fun. And figuring out a way of reaching out for help when you're not able to do it yourself. When you're laying in that hammock bawling in the summertime going, this is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. What the hell am I going to do with this? Figuring out before you're there, who are you going to call when that's a problem? Who are you going to say, hey, I need some help with this? Because we have a bit of a gap for everybody, and nurses especially, for getting the help that they need. We have a gap with them being able to recognize it and being able to get the time that they need, either time off from work or an allocation of time saying, okay, I'm going to take this bit of time and do this for myself just now, prevention or treatment. But we also then say, well, just talk to somebody and reach out. There's help available, but there isn't necessarily, or there isn't at the right level. Because I could teach the stress management thing on my employee assistance thing. So it's not news to me. And so then that comes back to taking my own good advice, but coming up with some sort of a network of people that can help you look further than your regular toolbox when they're not working. Because that's how I ended up at your workshop. And also being able to talk to other people about, hey, I'm burned out. Do you know anybody? And I was fortunate enough to have a group of friends and colleagues who I was able to do that for. And nurse burnout is unique, I think, from other professions burnout in the unique stressors of the job and the kind of tough and resilient people that nurses seem to be, that we can push ourselves till we actually break doing this job, whereas that doesn't seem to be as big a factor in other people's jobs. That it's a job, not a career or a calling, it seems, where people say, you know what, I've had it, this job is enough. Whereas nurses go, oh no, it's me, I got to fix me and keep doing the job.
There's so much in there. I think one of the biggest things I pulled from it was this listening to yourself, this inner knowledge that we all have, whether we learned it through nursing school or through personal experience or through continuing education, wherever we learned it, or it's like this internal intuitive knowing, we know what we need and we know when something's not right. And so it kind of ties back to, what you were saying about how if we don't listen, it starts to show up in other ways, because eventually your body is going to tell you, this can't continue, right? Like if you don't do something differently, this can't continue. And it starts to show up in physical ways, which you can't ignore, because you literally cannot. You potentially could die if you continue to ignore them. So I feel like the tools that you're speaking of are really like listening to your own advice, which is listening to yourself, right? And sometimes we need to wear that other hat and be like, what would I say to a colleague? What would I say to my daughter or to my best friend if she was feeling like this, right? Knowing everything I know about my life, if this were my best friend, what would I say to her? And then taking that advice and actually doing something about it. Because knowing is so much different than doing, as you know, as we all know. So
very much.
Yeah. Is there anything, Natasha, that further that you feel like you'd like to share with us before we end for today?
No, I just think having these conversations with other people's experiences is a really valuable thing to do, because it lets people know that they're not alone in where they are with, struggling with burnout, recovering from burnout, wanting to avoid becoming burnt out, and just dealing with all the other, self-care and mental health things that go with this profession. Because I think that it's fairly common to have people show up at work with their game face on, and behind closed doors, that's not how things are. I think the feeling that you're not alone is an important one. I've lost colleagues to suicide who were damn good nurses, who showed up and made a difference to their colleagues and to their patients, and they couldn't do it for themselves. And I don't want to be them, and I don't want anybody else to be them either. And that's why I think this conversation is important.
Yeah, I stand with you in that. I think it's the whole mission behind this is to end the silence about it. So we don't have to hear about people like you're describing. It is the awful, tragic reality of mental and emotional health is that sometimes ending it feels like the easier strategy. It feels like the only way out, feels like the only option. I know I've personally been on that literal edge in my life, and I know the hopelessness that you are sitting in that place. And I strive in this work I'm doing in this, through these conversations, is to not just end the silence, but to, like you said, to build this feeling, this community of support where you know that you're not alone, that you're not the only person who lays in a hammock crying or curls up on the bathroom floor crying like I used to, that we're not alone, that there is thousands of us who are feeling the same way. So I really want to honor you and just give you my utmost gratitude for showing up here and for sharing your story so courageously, and know that I'm here for you. I'm here for everyone in the best capacity that I can. And I know you are the same. I know you are a solid pillar of strength for your coworkers, and the wealth of experience and wisdom that you bring is a lot of advice that people should take, including yourself, right?
Yeah, and I'm hoping that having these conversations can help shift the perspective from this being a personal failing or personal health issue, although it is personal, to recognizing that it is a workplace hazard and it is not a failing, that this is something that does need to be looked at. I mean, being human entails having mental health as part of your picture. But I think some of the mental health and burnout things that go with nursing are unique, and it's too easy to say, oh, they couldn't cope. Mm-hmm. When I don't think we need to shift that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so true. Thank you so much, Natasha, for your time.
You're most welcome.
Because, I feel like that's a part of our human needs as well, is to be heard and seen. And it's really, a part of the platform for this whole podcast. So again, I just really thank you. I personally want to thank you for taking your time to listen to this podcast. It is my truest honor to sit with these nurses and witness them tell parts of their story. We as human beings have a deep need to be seen and heard, and this is my way of helping nurses in particular find their voice. Please know that the opinions shared in this podcast are those of the individuals sharing them and not a reflection of any employer or regulatory body. Our stories offer healing and create connection, two things that we as nurses need as we navigate the jungle of a healthcare career. So thank you for being witness. When we can come out of the shadows and into our light, we can create the change that is needed. And when we do this work together, we are so much stronger. Thank you for listening.